Hitting buttons. Oh, hey.
Hey, there it is. Calling Chris Anderson. Where are you?
I'm in Hurtubise on the Chemin des Dames, so I am appropriately enough on a Napoleonic battlefield, on a World War I battlefield.
Oh,
And
you are
you are?
just so special. Well, I
Oh,
am
yeah.
here at the Chicago headquarters of History
The
Happy
Chicago
Hour.
headquarters? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Back home again, and this is our first in we have 4 weeks of live shows. So
Crazy.
everybody, get tuned in, get dialed in. Welcome to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, which is why Chris is on the road. This is one of all the many tours that they offer in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. You can check it out at StephenAmbroseTours.com.
There we go.
And whether you're watching live or watching on replay or listening on the HHH podcast, thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about one of history's grandest figures. I mean, not Chris Anderson, but the other one, Napoleon, and in particular about the Napoleonic Wars. So let us know that you're here and what you're drinking. Chris, do we have anybody we know joining us today?
Yeah, well, Xavier's back, so that's good.
Oh, Xavier, welcome.
Jim Stark, Gene Templin.
Jim Stark's already got questions.
I know. I jumped in the line.
We'll have to go back to those. Okay. Wally Morrison, Jeannie Bow, Steve and Jackie Vietz. Hey, Chris, I want to mention I was at a World War II conference last weekend in Gettysburg.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, right. That just completely makes sense. And I met two huge fans of History Happy Hour, Lois and Jim Ullman. They've seen more than 100 episodes. They're probably out there right now watching this one. So Lois and Jim, if you're there, hey, great to see you. And we thank you so much. We appreciate everybody who watches. Everybody, especially our Patreon supporters.
Yes, especially our Patreon supporters.
And among those, we especially appreciate our top shelf patrons who have bought this bottle of HHH booze here on the right with their contributions. I don't even know what that is, but we appreciate you guys. And if you want to join and be a HHH top shelf patron and help keep the history tabs open, what's the website, Chris?
www.patreon.com/history happy hour.
There you go. That's the one. So
I guess right.
Let us know you're here and what you're drinking, and we'll get started. I think we have a sufficient number of people that we can get started, Chris. So why don't you give me a cue and we'll move forward.
Hey, remember the bell.
The bar is open.
Open.
What's on tap, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, really kind of super excited about this this book. It's we have Alexander Mikaberidze.
Mikaberidze.
Oh, see, you say that so much better than me.
And he says it even better.
Yeah, we're going to ask him too. But Alex is the author of more than 24 books about the Napoleonic Wars. He's written extensively about Napoleon's wars in Russia, some of the Russian personalities. He's a professor of history at Louisiana State University, and we are here to talk about his latest book, The Napoleonic Wars, A Global History, which has been getting all kinds of rave reviews for good reason. So I'm very, very happy to have him join us.
Alex, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, did you bring a cocktail, or did you just let
I'm
that
at my
go?
university office, so I can only drink coffee.
Oh, okay.
Or at least I will say that it's coffee.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I've got a beer, and I see, Chris, you've got what looked like a glass of wine down there.
Have a
Yeah.
Bordeaux.
There you go. So we're ready to go. Chris, you can take it away.
So Alex, just for starters, and I may be paraphrasing a bit, but in your book you talk about the mass of literature that's been written about the Napoleonic Wars. I think you say something to the effect that library shelves and bookshelves around the world are groaning under the weight of books about the Napoleonic Wars. Yet you somehow said, "I got to do another one." So what was it that made you say, "I'm going to tackle that"?
And as you answer that question, give us your best guess as to how many books there actually are out there about Napoleon.
Well, I'll answer the first question, and the reason will be arrogance, I guess, youthful arrogance.
Well, hang on to the youthful part.
Yeah. Um, as for the number, there was a guesstimate about 30 years ago that there were about 400,000 books written on this era. Most of it's focused on kind of French Napoleon and French side. So by now it must be well over that number. So maybe close to 2/3 of a million, because the last 20 years have seen remarkable growth in the output, in the way we reassess the wars, the individuals, or we kind of shed light on lesser known individuals or events. But I think the main reason why I wanted to do it, maybe because I'm from a small country of Georgia in Eastern Europe, and like all, I think, um, children of the small nations, you want to see your place in the world, right? And so every time I would look at Napoleonic history, Georgia was missing, and yet I knew from studying Georgian history that the echoes of that conflict had an enormous effect on Caucasus, right? And so ultimately, when I started looking beyond Caucasus and kind of looking at what about the rest of the world, I realized that despite thousands of books written on this topic, I think what is missing is the long-term impact that this period had overseas. And so my argument is that as important as Napoleonic Wars was to Europe, its legacy, actually, especially the long-term legacy, I think is more pronounced overseas than it is in Europe. I always remind my students that Napoleon ultimately is the loser, right? In that sense, that he lost Waterloo, his empire is erased from the map of Europe, and that many of the changes that he wanted to implement on the continent were either stopped or reversed or certainly constrained. But it is, but if we look broadly, especially outside Europe, you see that the impact of Napoleon is absolutely, or at least Napoleonic Wars is absolutely stunning. From the end of the European empires in the Americas to the creation of the European empires in Asia to the great changes that take place in the Middle East, all across the world, you see the impact of this period. So I'm not going as far as call it a World War One, but I certainly am arguing that it is a period in global history where European squabbles have disproportionately great impact on the global scale, far greater than 7 Years' War.
Well, it definitely, and we'll get into this. It definitely, reading your book, it definitely feels like a world war as you see the impact of what happens on a battlefield in Europe ripple out in your writing to Canada, to the Caribbean, to China, India, the Middle East. But before we get into that, I'm curious how you, growing up in Georgia, not necessarily known as being a hotbed of Napoleon scholarship. How and why did you become, I don't want to say you're a fan, because that would imply you're rooting for Napoleon, but how did you become a Napoleonic scholar?
Thank you. I do appreciate you. I think that nuance that you added to it, because like any historian studying a complex period or complex individual, it's. I think it's a disservice to simply say you're a fan of something, right? And certainly something as complex as Napoleon as a personality or Napoleonic era as a figure. And I hope we'll get into the discussion of Napoleon as a historical figure. But I was a young boy, about 10 years old, when I went to a bookstore, and there on the bookshelf was the book, a large kind of weighty tome that was a biography of Napoleon written by one of the eminent Soviet historians. And so for some reason, it piqued my interest. And so I just picked it up, paid the money, and started reading. And that biography is to the present day one of my favorite. Maybe it's nostalgia, but it's very well written, and it has those elements of both critical historical discussion, but plenty of the Napoleonic kind of myth, right? That gets us all. I tell my students that Napoleon's is shrouded by myth, and this myth is like a siren. It calls on all of us to get closer, and some of us get so close that we're consumed by it, but some of us realize that you need to keep a distance and kind of look at at him and at his spirit at certain length, and then be rational and critical minded. But that's how I got it, and I never really wanted to be a historian as such. I loved history, but my first choice was law. I studied to become a lawyer, finished my degree, practiced law, and then at one point decided, no, history is the thing I want to
Oh,
be.
you are crazy.
You decided that you were in law, but you looked around and you said the money's in history. So that's
Exactly. I think, Chris, you and my wife have a talk, I guess, before because she tells me exactly the same thing.
I hate. Oh, so Alex, this is going to sound really silly, and I apologize, but what's the start of what we call the Napoleonic Wars? I mean, is there a Pearl Harbor moment, or when do you say, okay, these wars have started, and these are different than everything that's gone before?
I think the traditional kind of from historiography, kind of how historians organize the period, we split up the Wars of French Revolution, which began in April of 1792 and lasted until 1802, when Napoleon, as part of his peace outreach, was able to negotiate peace all across with all the coalition members. And then from 1802 to spring of 1803, we have a short interlude where Europe is essentially at peace. And then in the spring of 1803, you have a breach that begins with the conflict between England, or Britain, and France over fundamental kind of geopolitical issues that they find cannot be resolved. And here, to borrow that famous Thucydidean kind of formula, here you have the rise of one power and the fear that it engenders in another, because what happens is that by the time the French Revolutionary Wars are over, France is a hegemonic power in the Western Europe, and peace gives it tremendous advantage over Britain. And so ultimately, the decision is made, especially in British circles, to announce a war, to declare war on France, and it begins in the spring, in May of 1803, and that is the conflict that will last, well, essentially unremittingly for 12 years, or at least until 1814, when Napoleon is first defeated, and then when he returns back, he's defeated again, and the war will finally over in 1815, ushering a remarkable era of about 30 plus years of peace in Europe.
But how is this? I mean, I guess, where is the break? Why is this not just a continuation of the conflicts between, say, Britain and France before that, right? I mean, it seems like this is now going off in a different direction.
Mm-hmm. No, I do make that argument, actually, in my book, that maybe historiography it needs to be a little bit corrected. That it's convenient to divide them into two different periods, but what you see here is the Napoleonic Wars are a direct continuation of Revolutionary Wars. If nothing else, the hand that Napoleon is dealt, right, this geopolitical hand, is the one that was kind of shuffled and prepared by the French revolutionary governments. And more broadly, I argue in the book that the Napoleonic Wars is in many respects continuation of pre-revolutionary conflicts. And those can go back, we can go back to Louis XIV, because in early 1800s, Europe faces a situation that, like the one that it faced at the beginning of the 18th century, when France under Louis XIV is up and right, kind of a dominant power that is willing to throw its weight around. Napoleon does the same thing in the beginning of the 19th century. And in both cases, in order to contain this threat, European powers have to form an alliance, a coalition. So in Louis XIV's case, it was a Grand Alliance, right, of European powers. In Napoleonic case, it's a series of coalitions that ultimately prevail, although they have a steep learning curve until they finally prevail in 1813-14.
So we're going to get into, and we keep promising it, but we're going to get into the aspects, the World War aspects of this. But I wanted to ask one question about Napoleon. He is in the French army. He's from Corsica. He is rises up and is victorious in Italy. And what is it about him? I mean, you've studied him in depth. What is it about him that makes him, he is a diplomat who can make peace. He is a general who can win all sorts of battles. He doesn't win every one, but he wins all sorts of amazing battles. He is a reformer of the law, creating the Napoleonic Code. He can be gentle. He can be severe. But what is it that about Napoleon that sort of seems to fill the spotlight during this period?
He's a very complex human being, and probably among the most talented that we've ever encountered. He has in many respects, he's a charisma personified, and there is certain presence that he has from early on that captivates people. General Dominique Vandamme, one of the kind of prominent figures in the French army, a very gruff war veteran, a combat veteran, who says in one of the passages that he feared neither God nor devil, and yet he says, "I trembled like a child when I approached Napoleon." Right? There's this certain presence that Napoleon has. Everyone remarked that he has that gray-eyed gaze that was penetrating, that could kind of tap to the bottom of your soul, and yet he has the magnetic appeal. He's a man of a powerful personality and a great story, right? This kind of the story that he, in many respects, cultivates very carefully. The story of rags to riches, from nothing to the great imperial dominance, and then back to being, to exile. And certainly he benefits from the fact that he lives in the age of of romanticism, and he's quickly becomes a romantic figure. And so in many respects, the public image that we have of him is that that is crafted by romantics of the 19th century, a tragic figure that right, he ends his life on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He certainly milks that vision, because he portrays himself as a Prometheus, chained to a rock, and being tortured by this British vulture, right? But he's a workaholic. We know that he had a remarkable capacity for work. He has a remarkable character traits like photographic memory, ability to retain details that are simply staggering. When I was working on the trilogy of 1812, kind of exploring his campaigns in 1812, you would see him sitting in Moscow and tracing movement of battalions all across Europe, which, that requires him to be able to retain information that flows from all across the empire. And by that time, the empire essentially encompasses much of Europe, and he's able to control and to keep track of it. Of course, the reforms that he introduced are important. These are reforms that, in many respects, are the reason why Napoleon matters. Not because he fought battles, not because that he kind of won wars. Those have an important element in themselves. But to me, it's not the military Napoleon as a military figure that is important, but it is Napoleon as a reformer. The first 4 years of him being in power are probably the most exciting part of him, when he introduces the lasting reforms that underpin modern France. Choose any aspect of modern French daily life, from legal system to judicial to administrative to financial, and you can trace the origins of that system to Napoleon. And I think Talleyrand, his talented foreign minister, has the wonderful quote when he says that he knows all, he does all, he can do anything. And this is, of course, before the fall. And that was a perception of him, even among his enemies. Wellington famously compares him to on the battlefield presence to 40,000 men. And the last point is from that I want to make is from the minister, a really talented minister Napoleon had. In fact, that's one of the, I think, hallmarks of him, his ability to surround himself with capable men, irrespective of their political inclinations. So he has people who are Republicans, who are regicides, who are diehard monarchists. He recruits people based on his perception, on how he perceives them as talented, committed to the cause. And then one of them is Minister Molé, and he has this wonderful quote that stuck in my head, where he said that although Napoleon's common sense amounted to genius, somehow he never quite knew where the possible led off. And I think that contradiction, where he's a supremely pragmatic guy, but ultimately he's overthrown because he failed to find that line where the possible lets off.
Can I do one quick follow up on that, Chris?
Absolutely.
And then I'll just throw this question from Wally Morrison, who very succinctly says, "Okay, talented person. What were his faults?"
Oh,
So give us 30 seconds or so on his faults there, and then we'll move forward.
quite a few. He is quite callous. He's quite ruthless. He, in many respects, ignores prudent advice, especially towards the later half of the empire. He is insistent on following his inner voice, disregarding very prudent suggestions that his ministers had for him. That includes decision to go to war against Russia, where almost everyone around him cautioned not to, and even later when everyone cautions him, advises him to make a deal and accept the conditions that the coalition offers him in Prague in the summer of 1813, and later on in the fall at Frankfurt, he just refuses to be reasonable. So that's one of the problems. Second, I think he is driven by the sense of power. Right? He famously says that power is like a mistress to him, and that quest for power pushes him to make decisions or to attempt things that, from a modern point of view, is far less certainly jarring. We can say that Napoleon is at the forefront of establishing the police state, kind of surveillance state as such. I mean, the police system that he develops is quite stunning in its reach, in its ability to penetrate the levels of society. He can be, as I mentioned, callous, and on many occasions he kind of looked quite coldly at the human misery and kept moving forward. So I think there are a lot of jarring angles to him that we should be aware of as we talk about him. That the Napoleonic legend should not smooth these angles.
So, Alex, we talk about the Napoleonic Wars as if it's kind of like one thing. We talk about the Napoleonic era. You've got a 900-page book that talks about the Napoleonic War. Are people at that time aware that this is not just a continuation of what's gone before? Do they know that this is different? If you had said to somebody in Prussia in 1806, these are the Napoleonic Wars, would they have understood what you're saying?
No, because the very term actually comes much later. In fact, as part of this discussion in the book, I try to point out that when we talk about the term Napoleonic Wars, it kind of puts the onus, the responsibility for the wars on his shoulders. Right. And yet we don't do that, let's say, for Frederick the Great, right? We don't call it Frederikian Wars, right? And I think the term is a reflection of the remarkable dominance that this single individual exercises, but it is also true that the conflict was not perceived as such at the time. In fact, if we look at the Russian, Austrian, or Prussian kind of perspective, oftentimes they blame British for the outbreak of the war, especially on the Russian side. There is
How appropriate.
Yeah, I was waiting for that. Yeah.
I mean, there is a reason why the prefigis Albion, right?
Yeah.
Is circulating.
Tried to tell you, Chris. Oh, so someone's got a text. So.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Alex. Sorry.
No, so the term itself, Napoleonic Wars, comes after the event. So it's a later creation. For the contemporaries, this was just the Great War. I think in British, for example, in British experience, this conflict was known as the Great War. In Russian context, this was known as a struggle against Napoleon, and later on, when Napoleon went into Russia, it became known as the Patriotic War, or that will be so enshrined in popular memory that when World War II happens, right, it will be kind of referred to as the Great Patriotic Wars, and then kind of parallels to Napoleonic invasion. So no, the perception is not that this is just Napoleon rampaging across Europe, but that they are complex factors at play.
So, getting at the heart of this book, you write, this is quoting you, Austerlitz, Trafalgar, Leipzig, and Waterloo all hold prominent places in the standard histories of the Napoleonic Wars. But alongside them, we must also discuss Buenos Aires, New Orleans, Queenstown Heights, Rus, Aslandus, Asaya, Macau, Orvez, and Alexandria. It's a challenge there. Every time something happens in Europe, your book takes us to Egypt or India or the Caribbean to look how those impacts ripple out. So I want to ask you, put you on the spot and say, can you give us one example? Now you can start thinking furiously, and I'll talk a little longer to give you time. Can you give us one example of how the conflicts in Europe have an impact elsewhere that is generally overlooked? So you can't go with the Louisiana Purchase, because that's the one we know about. But go with something that is generally not included in the Napoleonic War experience.
Yeah, I think one of the good examples will be Trafalgar. So we know that it takes place in October of 1805, right, as Napoleon is on his way to his triumphant victory of the coalition. And of course, that sets, it's a part of that rivalry between France and Britain. And in the popular imagination, Trafalgar is this great victory that ends the maritime struggle between France and Britain, essentially resolved in favor of Britain. But the reality is that the struggle continues until 1812. So there is the enduring French threat. And more crucially, what I find interesting is what happens in the wake of Trafalgar, because here you see kind of British political military establishment getting carried away by the victory achieved at Trafalgar. Because right in the wake of Trafalgar, we see the attempted invasion of Buenos Aires. Right, this is an expedition that is initially sent to South Africa to remove the French presence in South Africa. So that has a direct connection to this European development. But then from South Africa, Popham, who is in charge of this amphibious expedition, is sailing to Buenos Aires. And Buenos Aires invasion, of course, is crucial, both because British will be defeated there. Right? That's an important story in itself. But also what it gave to the locals, this newly acquired sense of what it meant to be Buenos Aires, or what it meant to be a resident of Rio de la Plata at a time when technically you're part of Spanish Empire, but Spanish Empire can't protect you from the British because Spanish fleet is at the bottom of Trafalgar Bay. And so that story is then kind of enlarged and becomes even bigger when Napoleon decides to take over Spain. And in 1808, Napoleon removes the Spanish monarchy from power. So now the residents of Buenos Aires have a choice to make. Do they stay loyal to the government, the Bourbon government, that was unable to protect them in 1806? Do they support the new Bonaparte government, or do they seek a third option, maybe option of independence? And so for me, this is a story that is interconnected, that the echoes of Trafalgar can be seen in South Africa, it can be seen in Buenos Aires, and then beyond. And of course, we can again look at the. I think I sent you this map with little dots, right, over all over the world, and each of those dots to me can be connected to a certain development in Europe.
I don't think I got that map, so I
Okay,
apologize.
no problem.
Even if it's not my fault, I'm apologizing because that's what I do.
Yeah.
Chris,
So correct me if I'm wrong, but there are 7 coalitions that come together to defeat Napoleon.
There are 7, but I do want to point out that the first 2 are not necessarily against Napoleon as such.
Right.
The first 2 are against the French Republic.
Right.
Although Napoleon is involved in fighting in the second coalition.
Okay, well, that'll tie into this. Then, is there something that's different about these coalitions? Does Napoleon and this conflict create a different sort of coalition than what had gone before it? And if so, what? And what does that mean for all these other countries?
Each coalition is the result or reflection of this particular set of circumstances that take place at that junction in time. So the first coalition began as the alliance between Prussia and Austria, and then grew in size in the wake of the execution of the French king in January of 1793. But one important commonality kind of to these coalitions until the sixth coalition is that even though on paper these coalitions look imposing, in reality the coalition partners oftentimes acted disjointly, failing to coordinate their moves or unable to bring their forces all at once to the battlefield where they could inflict the decisive defeat on the French and certainly Napoleon. And it is only in 1813 that Napoleon and France essentially is facing united coalition force. So look at, let's say, events of 1790s, right? So here the French armies are facing Austrian army or Prussian army, right? Or they will face occasionally British expeditionary force. Same applies in 1805, right? Napoleon is able to defeat Austrian army, then Russian army arrives, and then he defeats Russian army with the remnants of the Austrians. And then 1806, he defeats Prussian army, right? Even though it's part of this fourth coalition, and Prussia is supported by the British and the Russians, at Jena-Auerstadt, it's the Prussian army that is hammered. And then Napoleon goes and defeats the Russians in the Polish campaign. But in 1813, what happens is that Napoleon is facing a combined force of Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Hence why when we look at events in the fall of 1813, this is a war that is factored different from the one that he previously faced. There is a reason why Leipzig is the largest battle before World War I, right, in Europe. That battle has well over 500,000 men fighting in and around the city over 3 days. And here Napoleon is facing the combined forces of Sweden, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. So it's a massive coalition that he's confronted. And so that is a reflection of the coalition partners kind of learning how to confront Napoleon. Part of this learning curve was to figure out what made French system so effective. So you see, for example, in the wake of defeats at Austerlitz, at Jena, and then later on Friedland, that these defeated coalition partners are trying to emulate the French and borrow parts and parcels of their system to improve their military capacity. So artillery reforms in the Russian army take place after Austerlitz. Of course, Prussian military reforms start in 1807 in the wake of the devastating defeat at the Jena-Auerstadt. And then at the same time, Austrians are reforming their military in 1805, 1806. They will try to confront Napoleon in 1809. They will lose, so they will again have to kind of go back to drawing board and see what needs to be improved. By 1810-11, you see, for example, Russians borrowing corps system that French used to such a deadly efficiency on the battlefield. So in 1813, the armies that Napoleon is facing are fundamentally different, at least in terms of how they move, how they command it, how operationally, right? On this operational level, they're fundamentally different from the ones France faced in 1792.
I want to remind everybody that we're chatting here with Alexander Mikaberidze, who's the author of The Napoleonic Wars, A Global History. How'd I do on the name, Alex? He's not answering.
You did, yeah. You clearly practiced, Rick.
Okay, that's all I'm doing while you're talking is practicing saying your name.
You got bonus points for it.
And I want to bring in. We have many comments and questions going on, and I want to bring in some of that. And we have a kind of an ongoing discussion that's taken place here in the chat column about whether the Napoleonic Wars were a world war, and a comment that comes up from David Picker is, it was a world war, as the 7 Years' War was. A war fought on 3 continents and all oceans qualifies as a world war, I submit. So where are you on this question?
Yes, that's a great. I think it's an ongoing debate, so I'm not sure my answer will necessarily settle it. But the way I look at it is that this is a European conflict that is unfolding on a global scale. It doesn't necessarily mean world.
So you're basically trying to have have both.
Yeah, no. The reason I'm saying is that it certainly doesn't, in terms of mobilization of the kind of on the world scale, China has negligible involvement. Right? It has, the wars affected, but certainly Chinese military is not involved. Same applies in Japan. The wars affect parts of Japan, but the Japanese army is not necessarily directly involved like it would be in World War II, right? Same applies for Africa, right? Parts of Africa are significantly affected by this war, but much of it, right? If you've been in Timbuktu, or if you are somewhere in South Central Africa, chances are you went along with your life without really necessarily ever hearing about this conflict. But my argument is that it's a European conflict on a global scale, and in terms of intensity and scale, that it dwarfs anything that preceded it. It's far bigger in scale and intensity than 7 Years' War, bigger than the War of Austrian Succession. It has a far more pronounced effect on North America, on South America, on Asia, on Middle East, and so in that sense, it's more intensive.
So there is so much in your book that caused me to sit back and go, wow, I really hadn't thought about that. So obviously we're kind of limited by time, but one of the things that caught my eyes, I'm reading through it, is of course the invasion of Russia, and that for somebody with a bare bones knowledge of the Napoleonic Wars, the classic story is everything's going great for Napoleon, and then he goes to Russia and it snows and he loses and it's all downhill from there. But in reading your book, you were saying that when he comes back from Russia, it's bad, but he can marshal a force and things. He thinks that we can turn this around. So, do we make too much of the invasion of Russia, or what should we do with that?
No, I don't think we made too much of it, because it is a massive blow to the empire. That Napoleon, short term, manages to recover, and he certainly came very close to turning the tide in the spring of 1813 when he scores 1-2 punch blows on the Russians and Prussians at Lutzen and Bautzen. But I think here what he's confronted with is the reality that the coalition partners have improved sufficiently that he can't simply end the war through a military victory. The war requires a political solution, and that political solution eludes him, partly because, and I would say maybe even a lion's share, because he is unwilling to compromise. That is especially to me evident in the summer of 1813 during the armistice at Pleschwitz, where the Allies, especially Austrians, are willing to negotiate with him to find a way to end this conflict, but the ending will be certainly not necessarily in favor of Napoleon. But that's what happens when you lose a war on a scale that he did in Russia, right? If you lead more than 500,000 men and most of them don't make out, and not necessarily dead, but well over 150,000 soldiers were kept as prisoners of war in Russia until 1814, right? So this is a massive loss of life. It's massive loss in terms of equipment. Next to the human life, the next big blow that Napoleon experiences because of the loss in Russia is in horses and artillery. He loses more than 250,000 horses that simply cannot be replenished that quickly. So hence why in 1813 he time and again is unable to deliver the coup de grace, right, the decisive blow. Artillery problems also cannot be resolved in short term, and so that all should have pushed him towards seeking a political compromise, seeking a political solution. And time and again he refused because he believed that the empire was based on that military glory, on the military power, and the compromise would endanger it. But in hindsight, I disagree with that. That I think he could have easily negotiated with the Allies and found a political solution to it. Yes, it would have been unpalatable to him, but it would have benefited France far more than what ultimately happened.
So, bring in another question. It's another one from Wally Morrison. Wally's scoring today. How much of Napoleon's battlefield success was luck versus deliberate strategy versus the heroism of his troops?
That's a great question. Thank you, Wally. In every war, you need to have a luck. So I'm not going to say that luck played no role in this. And I think let me kind of maybe drill in on the most famous of Napoleon's battles and give you an example of it. And that's Austerlitz. We know that Napoleon prepared very well for that battle. Right, in the weeks leading up to the battle, he visited the battlefield. He scoured the terrain. He knew what to expect on a given day in terms of weather condition, the famous fog. He made kind of exploited to the maximum the military that he had. The fact that he could give an order to his Marshal Davout, who was in Vienna, and to tell him that he has to march some 76 miles in 48 hours and be confident that those men will actually be able to arrive on time. That is a testament to this military machine that he creates. But on the other hand, and this is where luck is, when I wrote my last book is the biography of Russian Field Marshal Kutuzov, and in that book I break down the other side of the coin. Right, I say, so here's what Napoleon did. Now let's look what the other side is doing. And there, what you see is that the Allies almost deliberately making all the mistakes that were needed for Napoleon to succeed. So that's where indeed luck plays a role. Here you have an army that is led by a czar and the emperor who've never commanded an army before, who are surrounded by officers who've never experienced a battle before. All of them encouraging their leaders to march on. Here's Alexander. This is his first battle. And he's surrounded by a posse of sycophants who all tell him how awesome he is, that this battle he will win hands down. And yet the men who've been to war, the men who have the first-hand experience of what it means to be on the battlefield, like the protagonist of my book, Kutuzov, who urges retreat, who urges methodical approach to war, are all shunned to the side because it's not heroic enough. And so Austerlitz to me is a great example of both Napoleon as a brilliant commander who can foresee what the enemy might do, but there is no denying that he was lucky that the enemy did play exactly as he anticipated.
So, Alex, there are a few people that have spent so much time with the emperor as you have. I mean, there's some, but you're kind of up there. What is it that, given how much has been written about him, what is it that we don't know about him, or what is it that you think sort of popular perception misses about this figure?
Well, short answer will be we know him quite well. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I recently was asked to write yet another biography of Napoleon, and I said no. Might be an easy subject in terms of producing a quick, concise biography, but I think there's plenty of those around. Mm-hmm. We have really embarrassment of riches in terms of Napoleonic biography, especially in the last 10 years. You see biographies by Andrew Robert, by Philip Dwyer, by Michael Brors. And we are not talking about a small biography. I'm not even mentioning small ones. I mean, these are massive volumes. Philip Dwyer's and Michael Brors' biographies are 3 volumes each. So I think there's a lot that we know of Napoleon as such. What is missing, however, is sides of his policy. Before we started this interview, I mentioned that one of the projects that I'm working on is this intersection of money and power. So my interest is, well, how was Napoleon able to fund all these wars? What's the financial system that underpins the war effort? What's his relationship with the financial sector, with the great banking houses, right? And that is not necessarily examined to sufficient degree. There is for example, again, if we stay on Napoleon, we still need a substantive reassessment of the colonial policy that Napoleon engaged in. Right? We know that he attempted to revive the French colonial empire, but what are the specific policies that he pursued? I think that's important. Even in the continental system, right? We have old studies, but I think there is much to be done in terms of re-examining continental system, not continental blockade. We oftentimes confuse these two concepts, but blockade is more kind of narrow focused on the British embargoing British trade. Continental system is far more encompassing. This is a system that envisions creating a new political economic reality in Europe, and that needs to be done, I think, again with the fresh approach, based on the sources that we now know are available. And those are the kind of elements that Napoleon's story is missing. And one last point is that I think there is a dichotomy between a difference between a scholarly vision of Napoleon that is quite critical of him, and rightly so, and a popular image of him. I experience that every time I teach course of Napoleon, where students come with Napoleonic legend, right, in mind. Napoleon is a romantic hero. There's a legend that is deeply ingrained, and one, I think, angles of his story is kind of chipping at this legend and showing the real man behind the legend, behind the myth.
So we have ongoing. I've just been reading some of the comments as we're going on. There's a lot of comments happening here, but I want to ask about the end of Napoleon's military career. He is defeated, and then is in the classic story here. He crosses over from Elba to France. He offers himself to the French troops that confront him. Shoot me, and they don't. And then comes the 100 Days campaign that ends in Waterloo,
where the British defeat Napoleon.
Where very famously the British
just throw that out there.
Napoleon, and I think Arthur Wellesley.
Wait a second, I do want to point out that the British were not
I think Arthur Wellesley is involved, and there's
I was waiting for that.
Blucher is there.
I'm gonna shout out to my Dutch and German friends.
I like where you're going with this, Alex. I like where you're going with this. But was there any chance in this 100 Days campaign of him succeeding, or was this just kind of I'm going for the glory and letting it happen, and maybe there's a 1 in 1,000 chance, but was there any real chance of his being successful there?
I don't see it, and I know some of my colleagues disagree, but I see that any vision of Napoleon surviving in 1815 is not supported by contemporary sources. Napoleon, when he comes back in March of 1815, he promises peace. He promises that he wants to live in peace with the rest of Europe, and that he would not engage in any aggressive activity. But he made his choice of timing was quite weird in that he escaped from Elba when Congress of Vienna was still meeting. And that meant that all of his enemies were essentially in one place, and that they could simply get in the room and craft a policy, craft a strategy against him. And one of the first things we see as soon as the news of him escaping reaches Vienna is the his announcement that the coalition will be revived and that they will fight against him. In fact, if we look at the announcement of the declaration of the war that the powers issued, it's actually a declaration of war against a single man, and they are careful to specify that they are not fighting French people. This is not a war as such against France, but it is against Napoleon. And so I cannot see how in that reality, when all the great powers were determined to remove him, how he could have survived. Yes, there are some people who suggest that that he could have won at Waterloo. That yes, in Wellingtonian description, it was a close run, right? But even if he had won at Waterloo, we know that there were 500,000 Austrian and Russian troops on the way to France, and he would have found his Waterloo, right, his quote unquote, at some other small Belgian village, or maybe a village somewhere in the Rhineland. The coalition was determined to remove him. It's not the same that they were determined to undo Napoleon necessarily the reforms that he introduced. In fact, if anything, we know that they allowed France to retain the system that Napoleon introduced. Right, that's where Napoleonic legacy really survives in France, because the coalition was not keen on undoing his reforms in France, but they simply could not tolerate him.
Well, yeah, I understand that. So, I mean, one of the things that I've always wondered about, and there may not even be an answer, but what is it that he wants? I mean, is there an end state? Is he driving towards a point, or is it just, the quest for power? What is it that keeps him going, or keeps France going, even?
I think in the book I'm arguing that what Napoleon has in mind is this concept of universal empire, and that is a reality where he creates a new political, economic sphere in Europe, right? And he comes very close to pulling that off. It's later on at St. Helena Island, right? He talks about a vision that he wanted to fulfill of United States of Europe, right? But what he means here is essentially creating a political economic reality where Europe is united, and he has one set of laws, and at no point did Napoleon or anyone else actually, or in France, consider that the French system is inferior to any other. In fact, one of the remarkable things about Napoleonic imperialism, when we deal with regards to relationship to the other states, is that the French all were convinced that their system was better, that it was inherently better, and that Napoleon's commanders, governors, prefects, auditors, they all believed that what they were bringing was an improvement on local systems, on local laws, on local taxes, on local administration. It was, I mean, they all perceived them as agents of mission civilisatrice, right? That they would benefit the people that they were occupying. In the book, I mentioned the great quote from Marshal Mortier, who in 1806 occupies the German city of Kassel. And he issues a proclamation. And in that proclamation, he says, "I've come to occupy your land. you have nothing to expect but improvements. You guys suck. We're bringing better system. We're bringing better laws. We're bringing better administration. And in many respects, right, they are right, because Napoleonic system is more streamlined. It's more efficient. It has many advantages, but of course it comes at the expense of imperialism. It comes at the expense of occupation. But the vision is that of a sphere that is dominated by France. And I've read through almost the entirety of this new set of Napoleon's correspondence, over 40,000 letters in it. And if you read through post 1805 correspondence of Napoleon, you see same thread that he wants to make France great. Mm-hmm. Almost tempted to say great again, but that's the vision. He constantly refers to France above everything, France above everyone else. So this would have been a vision of European Union, but dominated by France, ruled by French laws, French currency as the currency of exchange. It doesn't necessarily mean freedom of market, because I think this is where Napoleon was quite a thorough mercantilist. He envisions this universal empire serving French economic interests, and he creates within the continental system kind of two-tier system where France can trade with everyone else, but everyone else has kind of barriers to how they conduct trade. But that's the vision he has in Europe. And if
I've had an audio problem, so I can't hear anybody here. But am I interrupting you, Alex?
Yeah,
I'm so sorry. I was just going to throw out a last question, which was give you 30 seconds on this before we go. Which is, as you may have heard, there's a new movie about Napoleon by Ridley Scott. Do you have your tickets yet? Are you looking forward to this, or are you dreading it?
I'm actually hosting a premiere. We have a wonderful film center here, and I've talked to the administration. We are hosting a premiere that week, so when it's released. So, yes, I'm very excited to go, but with a lot of trepidation, because the trailer has a lot of problems in it.
Well, we'll touch base with you after you've seen it and get a report that we can put online to our fans. But we want to thank you so much, Alexander Mikaberidze, author of The Napoleonic Wars, A Global History. Really a fascinating discussion today.
Fantastic, guys.
Thank you, gentlemen. It was an honor to be here, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Read the book. There's just so much in it.
Yes, it's full of excellent stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex.
So I did manage to disconnect audio, but it wasn't my own audio.
Final question, and then you just
you were going in with the final?
No, he was answering, and then you just like kind of asked him about this.
I thought he was done. I couldn't hear anything. I was like the admiral at on the Yamamoto at Midway. I just screwed up.
How do you make that transition?
I just screwed up. But speaking of Midway, next week we'll dive back into World War II with an emphasis on the word dive. We'll be talking about submarines at Midway with Mark Allen, who's the author of the new book, Midway Submerged. And submarines are usually considered a sideshow at Midway. And the aircraft carrier battle was the big deal, but they were an integral part of the Japanese attack and the U.S. defense of Midway Island. And we will get into that, Chris. We will totally get into that. Guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse all those old shows at historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.